There are no slides. It's just me. It's pen and paper. Just me. Thanks so much to Mika and Andrew for having me back. Actually, when we launched All Out a few years back, we did it at PDF in Barcelona, so it's awesome to be back here with you all. I have to kind of broadcast an anxiety. I'm a black guy. I'm at a tech-driven conference, and I'm giving a speech called Who's at the Table? You all think you already know what this is about. You think this is the diversity speech that you've heard before. I know that's what you think. You think that I'm going to say, we need more women and people of color around the table. And you're going to nod apologetically. I'm going to say that if we don't find these undiscovered leaders, our movements are on a pathway to disaster. You're going to acknowledge that I'm probably right, but also not very helpful. We're going to go on like that for some time. I'm going to get done, and some of you will applaud me. Some of you will have left by then. Some may redouble your efforts. But most of us are going to go back to doing business exactly as we were doing it before we walked into this room. And I don't say that to belittle that conversation. I've actually given that talk 1,000 times. And I'll do it 1,000 more times, because it's one of the most important and difficult conversations we can have in our movements. But actually, I want to talk to you about similar issues, but with a slightly different way in. I don't want to talk to you about diversifying your staff. I want to talk to you about building a post-colonial internet. That's what I want to do today. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for giving me a chance. No slides or anything. So for me, this is the most fascinating question. How do we, as we're building a future, how do we build a future that not only creates new forms of power, but builds new forms of power that are distributed more equitably? How do new people have power? Not just how are new voices around the table in our organizations, but how are we fundamentally challenging the inequality that persists and dogs every one of the issues that we work on? To me, this is what I am obsessed about, and I'm inviting you into the conversation. We need to talk about inequality in our movements and in our organizations. And we need to ask ourselves whether we're actually challenging inequality or whether our organizations are unwittingly driving it. And for me, this isn't a question that's purely theoretical. It's actually really, really super practical. So the organization that I co-founded is called All Out, and we're now a movement of 2 million people around the world pushing to make sure that no matter where you are, that no person should have to sacrifice their family, their freedom, or their dignity because of who they are or who they love. That's what we do. That's what we care about. And every day, we're working through this problem. There's a really funny thing happening when you look at gay rights around the world. If you're in this country or in a number of other countries, all things look like pretty good. Everything isn't fixed, but if you look at the big trends, things are going fairly well. Increased legal protections, greater visibility, increased acceptance from families, from religious institutions, pretty much across the board, the trends are heading in the right direction. But if you look at the other half of the world, there's the exact opposite trend happening. In 77 countries, it's still a crime to be gay. In 10 countries, being gay can cost you your life. You have these two different versions of the world trending in exact opposite directions. And the reason that we created All Out was to actually stand between, to actually say, we don't want two versions of the world, that progress has to happen for all of us or it needs to happen for none of us. That's why we got started. And I think many of you started your organizations or got involved in your organizations or movements for a lot of the same reason. You saw those inequalities and you wanted to challenge them as well. But the question that we have to keep asking ourselves is, how are we doing that and are we doing that? So I'm talking about inequality. There's a lot of different ways to cut that, but I'm going to tell you the way that I want to talk about it, and you basically have to do that because I'm the one talking. So the way that I'm going to talk about it is basically this division that I see happening within our movements between these two sort of broad sets of people. So on one hand, I see these people who are the architects. These are people who have access to some resources. They have access to elite networks of power in governments, in media, foundations, in the private sector. They're able to do things like start new organizations, put on conferences. They're really able to dream big, to think about the future that we want, and who we want to bring into it. And usually, they're doing that in service of some really noble and inspiring goals. I think on the other side of our movement, we have people who are building. We have people who are working. We have organizers, community organizers. We have grassroots activists. We have individual activists who are on the front lines of the struggles that we care the most about. They're protesting in front of the company's outpost that's doing the wrong thing on environmental issues. They're going down to the State House and demanding marriage equality. These are the people who are on the front lines of the movement. And I think one of the things that I'm noticing, and that I see in my work at All Out and in other places, is that the dividing lines between these two groups is actually growing more stark. And the scariest thing for me is that as we build the internet, as we think about the future of our organizations and of the tools that we're going to build, what I'm seeing is that in the 21st century, in our 21st century organizations, the leadership looks a lot like the 20th century. And the question for us is, are we going to build something that's fundamentally new? Are we going to build organizations that challenge power and redistribute it? Or are we just going to build a tech-savvy version of what we already had? That's the question for us. But I think the really exciting thing for me is that there are ways that we can do this differently. And I think a lot of people in this room already are doing it differently. And you know, one of the things for me that's the most inspiring is that in the moment that we're in, we are given a chance, a great opportunity, to think about how we build, what we build, and who we're building it for. And one of the things I want to talk about is how I think we can build this post-colonial internet. How do we redistribute power? So the first thing that I want to suggest is that we need to open up our strategy. So one of the things that I think happens a lot is that we think about our strategic planning process for our organization. Maybe that happens once a year, maybe it happens once a quarter, but what our organizations need to do is open up our strategies every single day. Every day there need to be new and more entry points for more people to come to our table and to actually make decisions about how we do our work. I'll give you an example. We work with LGBT groups all over the world. And the reason that we do that is very practical. Oftentimes, the people that we work with are facing life and death situations. If we make the wrong move at the wrong time, people can actually be in real danger. Also, LGBT issues are very culturally driven. The language that's used to talk about them is completely different from, one city to another, much less one country to another. So we really need local insight for that work. We've been working for the last few years with activists in Russia who have been pushing against the anti-gay propaganda laws in that country. And when we saw that the Olympics were coming up, there were a bunch of groups in the US who came to us and said, the Olympics are coming, we are going after Putin. That is a bad guy. It's like, this is a Cold War era, evil, evil bad guy. And we want to go after him, we're going to get him around these Olympics. And one of the things all the US groups said was, we need to boycott. We are throwing down a boycott. We're going to tell Barack Obama not to send the Olympic team. We're going to tell other Olympic teams not to come. We're going to tell athletes to boycott. And we went to our Russian partners, who we'd been in contact with for several years, and said, what do you guys think about this question? And they said to us, don't you dare boycott. If you boycott, what will happen is all of this country will look at its already vilified gay population and say that we were the ones who colluded with the West in stealing Russia's Olympics. We'll be the scapegoats for your strategy. What we want is every country of the world to come to Russia and to make a huge stink about what's happening here. We want every country in the world, we want celebrities to come, we want athletes to come, and we want them to say the right thing, which is that no country should have laws that make it a crime to be gay. And that's the strategy that we pushed. That's the strategy that we helped get our allies in the US and around the world on board with. And it's a strategy that resulted in millions of people hearing that story and our Russian partners being elevated as opposed to vilified in that situation. And I think we can do a lot more of that. That's a tiny example from our experience, but I think we need to think about more ways that we build into the way our organizations work to bring people's voices to the table on a daily basis as we're making key strategic decisions that shape the lives of millions of people around the world. The second thing I think we can do is open up our technology. The technology that we are using to build movements, to empower people to make change, to demand action from their governments and from corporations, needs to work all over the world. It needs to be usable, it needs to be safe, and it needs to be internationalized. A movement where 90% of the tools for engaging citizens in public action are only in English and only optimized to work in the US is not going to work. It's not going to work. And I think a lot of you are in the same situation that I'm in, where you go, this is what the tools look like, and in order to push them 10% farther, to open them up to millions or maybe billions more people, it takes just that many more resources. But that's where we have to work together. If we're actually doing that together, we reduce the cost and we grow the impact of all of our work, and that has to be on the agenda. And I think that if we're thinking about things in this way, if we're thinking about opening up strategies, if we're thinking about opening up technology, we're thinking about not just how we're getting new people around the table in our organization, but how we're bringing new people to the table in meaningful ways. How are more people around the world architects of our movement, not just users? How are more people setting the decisions, setting the terms of the debate, not just showing up? And when I think about 25 years from now, when we're all sort of older than we are now, we're all going to be older, we're going to be a little bit slower, there's going to be a new smartphone, and we're not going to know how to use it because, we will have, jumped that curve. I think about, there are still going to be a lot of problems. A lot of the things that we're working on right now are still going to be broken. They're not going to all be fixed. But what will make us feel that we've done the right thing, that it was worth it to spend our lives invested in these organizations and building these things that we hope are going to create this change? And for me, it's being able to look out into a world and seeing a universe that looks fundamentally different, where we are networked internationally, not just on the coast in this country, but in the real America and in the rest of the world, where we have people who are taking tools that have been built in any number of places and able to use them in creative and new ways in their local context and building power that's actually making change. We won't have solved all the problems, but we will have built the movement. Thank you.